first week of going into the Tao Te Ching, and I will take it bite size. I will take 4 sections each week, and I will make a translation from the Chinese to the best of my ability, and I will try to copy out for you the Chinese characters and the literal transliteration, and then the words that I use, so that you can have before you each week the material that I'm going through. And so in 20 weeks we should be able to cover the Tao Te Ching. And I'm doing it bite-sized because there's so much misunderstanding of it. And the misunderstanding is compounded because Western academicians simply don't understand it at all. And the Western academicians have influenced the Chinese academicians, and so there's even less understanding among Chinese academics about the Tao Te Ching. And so it's a question of almost nobody understanding it, which then leads one to ask a very direct question: well, who is this guy who says that none of these people understand it? Well, the fact is that the Tao Te Ching can be disclosed to you in such a way that you can get used to thinking along with Lao Tzu. You can then go to any translation, any commentary, and you can see for yourselves that they don't understand. About 11 years ago, I hosted Chao Li Chi, who was at that time the rector of the Taoist Institute over in the San Fernando Valley, to give a guest lecture on the discursiveness of the Tao Te Ching. And he did a very good job at that time. And I think the point that he made is one that I should bring up here initially tonight, and that is that the Taoism of China is mysterious not because someone doesn't understand it, but because you do understand it. But there is a whole difference between life being mysterious because you can see how it is mysterious, as opposed to someone who says, well, I don't understand it, and thereby it's mysterious. Most of the contemporary scholarship on the Tao Te Ching can be written off. Now, part of what I'm going to try to do for you is to use a comfortable pace of language so that you can follow, so that you can synergize your mind with my voice. And I will try to keep it paced in such a way that kinesthetically a quality of patient approach will be easier for us. Now, in the Tao Te Ching, it is like a composition in music in which there is no crescendo, no coda, no recapitulation. There is a constant modulation of language which weaves itself. We talked in the very first lecture, 3 lectures ago, about how at the very beginning of the Tao Te Ching, the traditional beginning that we've been familiar with, the first section, every other word is Tao. So that Lao Tzu weaves the word, the character, Tao, into a pattern of language, and then turns that pattern over, and every other word is name. And this is characteristic of the way in which Lao Tzu uses language. He patterns language so that if we are paying attention to the pattern, any shift in one character will put a different emphasis on the whole pattern. And so Lao Tzu's thought is one of gestalts, as we would say in contemporary psychology. So we need to have a patient quality of attention to let gestalts form. And the model in Taoism for the way in which gestalts form in the mind is originally based on the observation of the way clouds form over mountains. That is to say, clouds form, if you've ever seen them, seemingly out of the thin air, and they weave themselves out, so that the edge of a growing cloud literally weaves itself into the air. Now, what's interesting about the Chinese Taoist sense of basic elements is that air is not one of them. Among the 5 elements, you will find earth and fire and water. You will find wood and metal, but not air. It's not that the Chinese missed air, but air is very much like the quality of Tao, not anything to be specified. And so it stands out by not being specified. So that if you have a natural sense of wholeness, and this natural sense of wholeness includes a familiarity with what is major in nature, whatever is left out will be outstanding for not having been said. And very often the Tao in Lao Tzu and in very sophisticated Chinese thought, the Tao is in what is left out. Now the word, the character in Chinese for what is left out is wu. Wu. Most Western thinkers translate wu as non-being, and this is an error on 2 different accounts. It is a logical flaw, and it is also an error in translation. Now let me just give you an example of this. The first Western thinker to ever point out the logical inconsistency of saying that non-being is a thing was Parmenides, a pre-Socratic philosopher. And he is famous for making the distinction between being and non-being in a classic way so that they are mutually exclusive, and it's called in logic a disjunctive. He said what is and what isn't. That you can't talk about what isn't as if the isn't was subtly an is. That there's no way whatsoever to talk about it. And the extension of this was the development of a whole school of Greek thought, not in Athens, but in a little Greek city called Elea. And Parmenides and his main disciple Zeno, and many of their disciples down the line, developed a kind of paradoxical philosophy showing that man's mind was incapable of understanding truth. Parmenides was concerned with truth, with aletheia, and he showed that man's mind, when it makes distinctions between things, is already erroneous because it considers non-things as being subtle things. Plato took this quandary, it's called a quandary. That is, if you want to get over this disjunctive, mutually exclusive polarity of Parmenides, if you want to get over that philosophically, that's a quandary. That means how do you put 2 things together that don't go together? And Plato was able to show that Parmenides was quite correct. That in terms of language, you can never say non-being and mean it. Because non-being presupposes some object in thought that the word non-being refers to. And there is no object in thought to which that word can refer. So that technically, it's nonsense to talk that way. Already, 2,400 years ago, this was established very firmly in Western thought. Yet you find, here's a monograph, a translation of the commentary of the Lao Tzu by Wang Pi, published by the University of Hawaii Press. And you read right away in the introduction here that they're going to translate Wu is non-being. Sort of concomitant with this stupidity, if I may be so bold to say, is the perception here that somehow Lao Tzu's writings were something that had been gone past by the time of Wang Pi, who lived about 240 AD. In other words, he lived roughly 800 years after Lao Tzu. This translator writes, of the several hundred extant commentaries on the Lao Tzu, that by Wang Pi is outstanding in several respects. For one thing, it is the oldest. For another, it is the first and most philosophical. Third, it reversed the strong trend at his time of interpreting the Lao Tzu in religious and superstitious terms. Most important of all, it not only raised the understanding of Taoism to the metaphysical level, but lifted Chinese philosophy itself to that level as well. It is not an exaggeration to say that Chinese metaphysics began with Wang Pi's commentary on the Lao Tzu. As if to imply that metaphysics is an advance over the mysterium. And we'll see that one of the points that Lao Tzu makes over and over again is that metaphysical imaging is distracting and delusion producing, and that we need to check ourselves by following the flow of reality and seeing that metaphysical images, when they produce anything, they produce a speculative disorder. And we'll see that this is one of the major points that Lao Tzu makes. The fact is that 800 years after Lao Tzu, there's no advance whatsoever. Many times the translator talks about how Wang Pi has gone beyond Lao Tzu. And this is just simply almost a throwaway, except for the service that it provides a translation of a rare text. What I will do is, each time we get together, I will give you the 4 sections and just help us to go through Lao Tzu as accurately, as pristinely as possible, and then develop it from there as the time permits. I will each time try to bring something in from Chinese civilization so that you can see how this is the central synthesizing core. And I will also bring in something from contemporary thought, contemporary human experience, to show how the Lao Tzu has, in fact, influenced almost everything in our time. And I'm going to go to not part 1, not chapter 1, but chapter 38. I'm going to start at the middle of the Tao Te Ching, because in ancient times, some 2,300 years ago, the second part of the Tao Te Ching came first. There are 2 parts, one entitled Tao, the other entitled Te. We've talked about Tao as being almost an untranslatable term, and so we just use the term Tao now, because our intuition is sophisticated enough that we have a sense for it. We have almost no sense for the Chinese term Te. It's translated as power sometimes. Sometimes it's translated as virtue. I'm just going to use Te, and you will get used to using Te just like you get used to using Tao. It'll be a quality that will disclose itself in your understanding. The first perception of Tao was that it was zero-based, that there is no numerical ascription that you can give to Tao, whereas Te is oneness. So Tao is like nothingness. Te is like oneness. And because of the dynamic, because oneness brought into juncture with nothingness, oneness stands out. And in ancient Greek philosophy, the term for nature, physis, meant emerging. The term in most savvy, primordial, not primitive, but primordial human communities, the word for nature means a dynamic, as in this emerging, standing out. So that when Te, oneness, is brought into proximity with Tao, nothingness, it stands out, and its dynamic of standing out is what creates Chi. And so the energy of momentum, the energy of the flow, the way that things are, that they emerge, that they manifest, as we would say. Why do things manifest? They manifest because oneness stands out, and by standing out, it sets a dynamic into process. So that there's a dynamic sense. Now, the Chinese character that translates as qi or qi is actually the vapor that comes off cooking rice. That was its original meaning. So that when you're doing the most basic activity to sustain life, which in China has always been cooking the rice, the vapor that comes off that release of vapor is the key. So that when Te occurs, by the very fact of Te occurring, you have Ki happening. And so Te will transmute. And it will transmute into something else. What does oneness transmute into? It transmutes into distinction. The one releases the two. And so two-ness, which can be understood as two in a sense of parallel, it can be understood as two in the sense of a dyad, two in the sense of duality, two in the sense of polarity, two in the sense of complementarity, two in the sense of resonance. There are many ways, and you can see that two has much more of this key. So that when oneness becomes two, the Chinese term, the Taoist term for the two-ness is Zhen, which is usually translated in the older things as benevolence, which is a Confucian use of the term Zhen. Quite frequently it's translated more accurately as human-heartedness. But what the Taoist understanding, what Lao Tzu would have us understand, is that we occur after the oneness of Te has emerged. We occupy the pivot of all those distinctions, the pivot of polarity. We're the focus of complementarity. We're the focus of the dyad, the parallel, the resonance. Let's pause here just for a second. Did Jesus say it's harder than a camel passing through the eye of a needle, or a rich man to get to heaven? And we can change it to any human being in our time trying to get wisdom. It's almost impossible. Let's keep trying. This movement that comes, notice that Tao does not move. Notice that the key is not something in Tao. Tao is not a container that has key. Many of these Western commentators on the Tao Te Ching misunderstand this. What is mysterious about Tao is that it has no movement, and so very frequently in Chinese civilization, in the excellence of the poetry and the subtlety of some of the philosophy, in the art sometimes, you get the Chinese sense that this is stillness. But it's a stillness of ultimate quality. And it is because of the absolute contrast between the stillness of Tao and the dynamic of Te that the Western mind associates it with power, when it isn't power at all. It's something more primordial than power. For it doesn't use the dynamic, but passes it on in such a way that the dynamic becomes exponential. So that the two is an exponent of the one. It's a higher power, if you will, of the one. So that the two, where we are, human beings, are supercharged because of the dynamic of oneness within us, releasing us, and what is characteristic of us is a balance. We balance the two. We balance the polarity. We tune the dyad. We reconcile the opposites. We live the complementation of the complementarities. And so, in a way, a phrase I used to use 25 years ago is that man is the tuning fork of the real. That human nature is like a tuning fork. We specialize in bringing twos together. And so the Taoist sense of what is human-hearted is that we bring the two-ness together in a harmony. Man is the bridge between heaven and earth. Man harmonizes heaven and earth. Who is man? Man is not something very small. He is the harmonizer of heaven and earth. He can bring two-ness so that even all of heaven and all of earth are brought together in his capacities to make a harmony. And so human beings in Taoism are formidable mysteries indeed. Every human being is unbelievable mystery. And because we are supercharged with ki in a dynamic which is capable of equanimity, that equanimity is fertile. It isn't the equanimity of dead even. It is not the equanimity of limbo, but it's the equanimity of a powerful quality of fertility, of being able to project out to another phase of reality. The Tao, the Te, the Gen, the fourth phase. And the fourth phase in Taoism are what we would call symbols. That is to say, the mind's power. The centers, the nexes of the mind's power. In Chinese, they're called yi, and generally yi is translated by the Confucian term for righteousness. And I'm going to preserve that because we, in contemporary English, understand righteousness, that sometimes righteousness can be all right, but people can overdo righteousness very easily. And when they overdo righteousness, it's because they're trying to beat us over the head with their righteousness and not practice themselves a righteousness. And so in Taoism, this fourth phase, and notice now that there are phases of the real, this fourth phase, righteousness, or the symbols in the mind, the trigrams of the I Ching, the idea of yin and yang, that fourth phase is also fertile and able to engender a fifth phase. And the fifth phase is so diverse, so exponentially diverse, that the Chinese use the character for 10,000 things, as they say. Myriad, sometimes it's translated, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands. It means, in the kind of language that we would speak, multiplicity. It means that the multiplicity of the world comes from the fourth phase, which are the structures of our mind. Now we can say, does this mean that the Taoists think that the world is a mental fiction? Not so at all. You have to turn that inside out and play it back in a different way. It means that the mind is real, and that its structures convey order to this world. That whatever order this world has, it has that order because someone's mind has given that order. So that the ancient understanding, which we've lost all taste for, we don't even taste it anymore. But 2,500 years ago in China, there was still a memory of the fact that there were certain human beings in ancient times then who gave the gift of order to human beings. Someone who first made fire, and then all the uses of fire came out of that. Someone who first made cultures, first made certain ceremonies, first made language, first made the wheel. That all of these elements of the world, which we know, were given to us by gifted human beings who saw them in vision, in symbolic vision. So the Taoist understanding is not anti-man, for man occupies the very center of it all. It's not anti-intellectual because mind is understood very precisely and pristinely. And it's not anti-world because the world is understood as being a part of the phase form of the real that has its source in Tao, has its emergence in Te, has its balance in man, has its formal symbolic envisioning in the mind, and has its expression in the world. And if the world is expressed by a mind which is free, which comes out of a balanced human being, which comes out of the Te, which comes out of the Tao, the world will flow back into the Tao and create a cycle, an ecology of the real. And this is known as the five-phase energy cycle. And Taoism always stresses that the Tao, without moving, produces eventually the world that flows back into the Tao, without any remainders, without any traces. The Chinese understanding of nature is just this ecology. And because it happens so instantaneously, because the Tao becomes Te, becomes Zhen, becomes Yi, becomes Li, becomes Tao, because that ecology happens spontaneously all the time, the sense is that the Tao is everywhere, all the time. And that if we wish to check right now how the Tao is, we can do so by bringing ourselves into harmony. That if we bring ourselves into harmony, if we provide ourselves as the tuning fork, we will note that the Tao as Te flows through us and our mind envisions accurately and the world becomes that. Now the Chinese term for this, for the thusness which we can experience in real equanimity, is a character, two characters actually, that are used again and again in the Lao Tzu. Tzu, Zhen, Tzujan. Our translator here uses the term self-so, and this was, I think, an acceptable term. Self-so, or sometimes in Buddhist influenced translations, it's called suchness, or self-soness. In the Tao Te Ching, the term that's used is chi, and it means not the chi, but it means itselfness. It means itselfness. So that occasionally, as you'll see in the translation that I give you tonight, Lao Tzu will say something, and as he's saying, when he wants to say that Tao is occurring in another form, he will use this term, chi, which means self-so-ness as its own self. Now here's the translation of these 4 sections for tonight, and just see if you can follow that all the way through, woven into this, Lao Tzu is putting this 5-phase energy cycle into language. Each of these sections tonight will have some quality of that 5-phase energy cycle. And each of the 4 that I'm using tonight themselves are a phase in a larger 5-phase energy cycle, and we'll see next week with chapter 42 that chapter 42 is the 5th phase in this larger expression of this energy cycle. So not only does the energy cycle occur in Lao Tzu's language within the chapters themselves become phases of a larger gestalt, and in this way, the original Tao Te Ching began. It began not with the discussion of Tao. It began with the writing on Te, and that's how we're going to begin. So we'll take the section on Te, and then in a month or 2, we'll come to Tao. This order of having the Te before the Tao is the earliest manuscripts that we now have of the Tao Te Ching. They were dug up in the late 1970s out of some tombs, ancient tombs, and they predate by almost 1,000 years the next oldest copies of the Tao Te Ching that we have. Why the Tao was put before the Te is a question that the mentality of the Roman Chinese, the Han Chinese, could answer. They wanted to forbid anyone from understanding. And of course, if you throw Tao at someone immediately, it becomes not mysterious in the right way, but it becomes mysterious in the wrong way. And human beings, for all time, when they don't understand something, they drop it. They don't pursue it. But the whole object of wisdom is that it is not superfluous, but that it is essential. That there is no way that we can live again unless we are whole. Only the whole reality of ourselves, knit together into a unity and cemented by conviction, could hope to survive death. We will not live again unless we are whole. So the whole object of wisdom is to return us to the flow of the eternal, and to not let us be thrown away by the circumstances of space-time, just mere fodder for accidents, but that in fact we can, with great confidence, understand how to return ourselves to the eternal without waiting for any experts, without waiting until we die. And so we begin with Te. And here's how it reads in my translation. Superior Te is not, quote, Te. Therefore, Te occurs. An inferior, quote, Te, quote, never loses Te. Therefore, no Te occurs. Superior te is a resonant action, and nothing thereby causally acts. Let's try that one again. Superior te is a resonance action, like a tuning fork. It's a resonance action. And nothing thereby causally acts. In other words, there's no causality in Taoism, but there's correspondence. So that action moves by correspondence and not by causality. Nothing causes this to move and contact that, and so forth. There's no shin bone connected to the knee bone connected to the thigh bone in Taoism. Whatever occurs, whatever real action occurs, whatever real doing occurs because there is a sympathetic resonance, because there is a correspondence. And there is a index, like a musical scale for all resonances. And that is the Tao, and Tao is the consonance of all harmony. And that's why whenever a correspondence happens, the correspondence itself is a resonance of the Tao. And that's why human beings, when a human being achieves equanimity, that's their correspondence with the Tao. When the Zen and the Tao are in harmony, when our human-heartedness and the Tao occur at the same time and place, then that consonance of the Tao is us also. We're not some little version of the Tao, we are all of the Tao at that particular consonance. And because the consonance is not dependent on space, because it is not dependent on time, we can extend that to whatever time, psychologically or clockwise, or even out of time. And we can do the same for space. And so our so-ness is not a philosophic concept, but it's a practice of harmony which can occur at any given moment in any given place. And once you get the taste of it, once you get the kinesthetic feel of it, it can be extended to any length, any duration whatsoever. You can see that the Tao Te Ching becomes an influence later on the Chuangzi, and the Chuangzi is the direct root of the development of Cheng and Zen Buddhism. The whole gist of Zen is a seed in the Tao Te Ching, which is germinated in the Chuangzi and which is developed by great genius later on in East Asia, about 1,000 years later. Superior te is not, quote, te. Therefore te occurs. Inferior, quote, te, quote, never loses te, therefore no te occurs. Superior te is a resonance action, and nothing thereby causal acts. Inferior, quote, te, acts as, quote, itself, and has thereby a pretending action. Superior Jen acts itself, but no thereby pretendings. In other words, when we are ourselves, there's no pretense. Superior righteousness, that's the E symbols. Superior righteousness, ideas, acts itself, but has therein pretensions. Why? When an idea is itself and acts to make itself applied, there is a pretense in that because there's no guarantee that this idea will work out. There's no guarantee that you can do this. There's a kind of a pretentiousness in this. So it is superior righteousness, but it's fourth in the phase. And because righteousness is fourth in the phase, its resonant, its correspondent is te. And te is this emerging dynamic, this oneness. So ideas or symbols tend to participate best when they are participating correspondingly with oneness. If you have a lot of symbols in your mind, it's very difficult to apply them. If you have one synthesizing symbol in your mind, it gains a lot of te. If you have one really good idea in your mind, it corresponds with te and becomes very powerful. It's this kind of thing. The next line takes the fifth phase and translate it as propriety. And I use the term propriety. It's rather old-fashioned, but I think it's all right. The term in Chinese li, sometimes later on in Confucianism, becomes principle, or sometimes it means the R-I-T-E, the rite, the ceremonial rite, the ritual. And in a way, you could translate it as ritual. But I think propriety, sometimes the translation is etiquette, in a kind of a derisive sense. In other words, if etiquette is appropriate and it's done right, it's okay, but etiquette can get out of hand in a hurry. Why? Because if you're not keeping it shaped, etiquette tends to be more and more shallow. And people who just respond to each other on etiquette level go astray very quickly. And this tendency for the etiquette, for the propriety level, for the li level, to go quickly astray, if not shaped and formed by someone, that would be sixth phase that tries to blink into being, is called disorder in Taoism. That's where the disorder is. Because the sixth phase is actually going back to the Tao. So that one of the characteristics, it's like the telltale characteristics of how the wind is blowing. If there is a returning quality, then the Tao is healthy. So always in the Chinese sense, the Chinese sense is not to reach as far as you can, but to reach as far as is appropriate for you. And if you do, the Tao is flowing in you, and whatever you will do will flow back into the Tao. And you will be in that stream, as it were. And because the Tao is forming as clouds over a mountain, and the stream is running through you, and there's no end to that, the most famous Chinese phrase in Chinese poetry is mountains and streams without end. So the Chinese sense of paradise to a Taoist is mountains and streams without end. And this was the whole motive for making landscape paintings, because the Chinese landscape scrolls were the way in which, in a very real way, the Chinese Taoist artists, philosophers expressed the kind of world that is made from the mind of freedom, from the balanced person, from the highly energized te, from the Tao. And that if one goes into the world of the landscape in a real way, puts your gem through your mind into that landscape, you can through that return to the Tao. And so hanging a Chinese landscape scroll was not something that you would do for just the general public. It was something you would do for the closest human beings to you on very special occasions, because together you could go back to the Tao together. It was a chance to experience the real together. And so Chinese landscape painting became one of the great expressions of Taoism. And we'll see how this influenced just everything in East Asian civilization. So the next line, after superior righteousness acts itself but has therein pretensions, superior propriety acts itself, but when no one responds to itself, it stretches forth its arm and enforces itself. In other words, propriety is very suspicious all the time. Etiquette is very suspicious all the time to a Taoist, because its essential nature, if you don't respond to it, it tries to force you to respond to it. You're not playing our games. You're not abiding by our rules. You're not in our political setup. You're not in our business setup. You're not playing according to the rules of this corporation. Shape up or ship out. Notice how the common language, shape up to our expectations or leave, get out of our expectant shaped world. Even common language, half a world away and millennia away, gives the underlying intelligence that's here. So that superior propriety acts itself, but when no one responds, itself stretches forth its arm and enforces itself. So that disorder comes out of this. So that Lao Tzu now then shifts to the underside of this whole development. He's talked about superior te. He's talked about superior te twice. He's not going to talk about Tao here because he's talking about te. So the first and the third line are about superior te. He doesn't mention superior Tao in the first line. But he speaks about te in a Tao sense in the first line. Superior te is not quote te, therefore te occurs. The third line, superior te, is a resonance action, and thereby nothing thereby causal acts. So the first line is about the Taoist quality of te, the second about the teist quality of te. Then comes Jen, then comes righteousness, then comes propriety. And now the underside of those five, losing Tao, there occurs te. Losing te, there occurs Jen. Losing Jen, there is righteousness. Losing righteousness, there is propriety. Now, propriety's properties are loyalty and faith exaggerated. In other words, propriety, worldly etiquette, is always an exaggeration. The Greek term for that exaggeration was personae, mask. The Tao Te Ching. The translation that was popular was published by Grove Press, translated by Arthur Whaley, called The Way and Its Power, the study of the Tao Te Ching and its place in Chinese thought. This is a first edition from 1935, but in the 1950s, The Way and Its Power was considered to be an expert translation and commentary. Arthur Whaley was held in very high regard, because in the 1950s there were very few of us who understood the difference between a Chinese mentality and a Japanese mentality. Arthur Whaley has a Japanese mentality. In fact, most of his translations are quite excellent from the Japanese, and he's able to translate a number of Chinese things, but he mainly has a Japanese mentality. Here's what he writes about Te in his introduction. The saying, he says that Tao has been absolutely no difficulty for Western scholars to understand. Well, that's quite interesting. The same cannot be said of another equally important term, Te. It is usually translated virtue, and this often seems to work quite well, though where the word occurs in the early pre-moralistic text, such a translation is in reality quite false. But if we study the usage of the word carefully, we find that Te can be bad as well as good. What is a bad virtue? Clearly, virtue is not a satisfactory equivalent. Indeed, on examining the history of the word, we find that it means something much more like the Indian karma, save that the fruits of Te are generally manifested here and now, whereas karma is bound up with the theory of transmigration, and its effects are usually not seen in this life, but in a subsequent incarnation. Te is anything that happens to one, or that one does of a kind indicating that, as a consequence, one is going to meet with good or bad luck. Now, it's a real letdown to think that at least a whole generation of people grew up thinking that Te was some kind of like power of luck. It's true, he goes on to say, well, Te is also used in ancient Chinese for planting a seed. But he says then that this means that it must be potentiality, using an Aristotelian notion, potential versus actual. This has nothing to do with Lao Tzu at all. Nothing whatsoever to do. And as you can see, Te is not luck. It has nothing to do with luck. It's precision. It has nothing to do with potential as some kind of idea as opposed to actual. It is the emerging oneness of all. When allness is conceived, and when is allness conceived? When we turn our attention from this world within, and we get used to seeing the within in terms of the within, and not just as some illusionary mirror parallel of externalities. When we learn to see within, with inner eyes, we see unity. We see the oneness. We see what Tao is called Te. That's how I know where the key for me comes, because I can look within with an inner eye, and I can see the Te in its oneness. I can see the unity. And I can be that unity in my human-heartedness. And I can be that unity to such an extent that my mind, in its freedom, can have real visions that resonate with oneness. This is what Lao Tzu is writing about. And this is why it is such an important part of a major part of our planet. And why it is such an important part of 21st century science. Because 21st century science is going to be correspondent with Tao. Already physics and astrophysics are already correspondent. And the organic sciences, the biology, microbiology, molecular biology, all of this is coming in constantly. That the Ching has correspondences with the DNA code, for instance. It is a well-known observation now. About 10 years from now, there will be an attempt finally to bring all of contemporary science at that time together into a single vision, and it will have doubt. You will have doubt. You will also have human-heartedness and be able to be real in this world. So it's important to us. After, in the 38th section, the one that we're beginning with, our first section, after Lao Tzu goes through this declension about Te, he goes underneath it and talks about how if you lose Tao, then Te occurs. In other words, it can happen also in this, not in the generating sense, but in the degenerating sense. So if you lose Te, what do you have? Then you have Jen. If you lose Jen, what do you have? You have the righteousness. If you lose righteousness, what do you have? Propriety. And notice that it isn't that anyone loses propriety, but that propriety pretends to extend itself, pretends that it's the only game in town. And that's the nature of propriety. That's the nature of worldliness. Someone who's caught up in worldliness thinks that worldliness is the only game that there is in the universe. Would not even hear a criticism or even entertain an emendation that perhaps the whole of this world in all of its meanings is but just a passing phase of a much larger amplitude of real. But we know that there have been human beings who have stood far enough away from the planet to eclipse the entire planet with their hand, graphically. And so we live in a generation where it's very easy for us to understand that the whole of human history on this planet is just one little bitty pebble in a river of stars without end. So it's easier for us to understand when Lao Tzu then writes, now propriety's properties are loyalty and faith exaggerated, and this is a beginning of disorder. Premature knowledge is Tao as its projected flower. Premature knowledge, jumping to conclusions, but even more subtle than that, premature knowledge of making up your mind before you have the equanimity and thus freedom of mind to see something accurately. So that when you jump to conclusions, the premature ideas that you have in your mind correspond to a quality of premature Te. So that what comes out of them then is a world that's shaped by prematureness, not just from your mind, but because your mind has brought the resonance of a premature Te also into play. So it's a rather serious flaw. Notice that Taoist ethics also reflectively put the whole burden of decision, of goodness, upon man, but upon man's inner mysteriousness. It's not that Confucians were the moralists and the Taoists were the naturalists and didn't really pay attention to human morals or human ethics at all. This is not true at all. Nor is the concomitant to it true that when Taoists pay attention to human actions that they are superstitious. This is a erroneous assumption made by people who have premature knowledge based on causally connected understandings of things and think, well, the Taoists are not looking at causality at all, so they must just be superstitious. Well, this is not true at all. They're being very precise. In fact, all of Chinese science is derived from the development of Taoism. just like modern Western science is coming into a real resonance with Taoism. Why? Because that's the way it really works. That's the way it really is. So that Lao Tzu then writes, 38th chapter of the Tao Te Ching. Premature knowledge is Tao as its projected flower, and this is a beginning of ignorance. Therefore, great amplified man dwells in thusness, not abiding in externalities. He dwells in the fruit, not in the expecting of a flowering. Therefore he avoids the other and chooses the former. Now there's a real decision-making power that's here at the end of the first chapter of the Te Tao Ching. I use Te Tao Ching because we're going to take Te first. Lao Tzu is not nebulous at all. He's saying, for this whole ecology of steps which actually occur, and actually occur in a negative mode too, they can wind to integration, they can unwind to disorder. Because of this, because of keeping them in view, the whole ecology, the whole cycle of occurrence, and understand that our place in it is as a pivot, which is only true to the extent that we keep equanimity as a quality of our sense of self. If we lose equanimity as a sense of self, the whole ecology of the real goes into a disorder. And because usually our deepest intuitions, that is to say, the body remembers the Tao very well. The body does not sin very easily. That our deepest intuitions, even on like bodily images, even on the sensations of what is right, we catch ourselves constantly and remind ourselves, don't do this kind of thing. Don't throw this kind of stuff out. This is not the way to be. But because we don't center it with our harmony, with our harmonized Jen, and don't really be that, we bounce in and out of the order of the real and the disorder of ourselves, and this alternating between true and false, eventually when someone has lived long enough, 35, 40 years, 50 years, you get jaded about any possibility of there being truth. Because you bounce in and out of truth and disorder so many times, you suspect that that's what's real. The ping pong game that never comes to an end, and well, that's as much as man can do. Whereas Lao Tzu says, you can know accurately for sure, and you can do it. And when this is done in a certain way, it makes itself real forever. There's no bouncing back and forth. Now, the Taoist term for a spirit which has done this is a Shen. Shen. The 39th chapter reads in this, in my translation, this way. Anciently, Te's unity is oneness. Heaven's Te is unity, thereby it is openness. Earth's Te is unity, thereby equanimity exists. Spirit's Te is unity, thereby is mind. Valley's Te is unity, thereby they accept. The 10,000 things Te is unity, thereby they have life. Princes and kings Te is unity, Thereby they become the world's standards. That which items itself is a unity indeed. A little bit of fancy English here. Syntax. That which items itself. Notice I shy away from the term identify, because you can get into a lot of problems, psychologically and philosophically, using the term identify lightly. That which items itself, which makes the distinct realization that I am a unity. I am this unity that I am now. That itemizing of oneself is unity indeed. Now notice how Lao Tzu now shifts ground just like he did in the 38th chapter. In the 38th chapter he gave the integration, how you spin it to integrate, and how you reverse the spin to disintegrate. And one thing to note here, he's going to do the same thing in chapter 39. Show the integration to show the disintegration. It's not that always the reverse spin disintegrates. If the integration has been done right, the reverse spin doesn't disintegrate, but differentiates. Differentiates. If the Tao, Te, Zhen are right, the fourth and fifth phases are differentiations. If the Tao, Te, and they are always right, Zhen is not right, then they disintegrate by trying to make a sixth phase instead of Tao again, and that's where the disorder comes in. So notice that in the Taoist sense, in Lao Tzu always, the Zhen, where we are, is the decisive pivot. If we don't do it, if we are not consonant with the Tao, whatever we do is going to scramble the pond of the real. There are going to be ripples of repercussions from everything that we do. Now notice how it's very similar in concept on the surface to karma. So when the Indian Buddhists went to China, they thought that the Chinese Taoists were like really close to them because they also understood karma the same way. It's not that at all. The South Asian Indian mind is a Western mind, whereas the Chinese mind is really not a Western mind at all, but an Eastern mind. Quite different. So here is the turn in chapter 39. He's shown the integration culminating in the statement, that which items itself is unity indeed. Heaven's emptiness, thereby clear, otherwise it would crack. Earth's emptiness, thereby steadfast, otherwise it would presumably break down. In other words, if heaven weren't clear, with its openness, if it were something, because of its vastness, it would crack someplace. The earth, if it were not really steadfast, would presumably run down eventually. If there were not a circulating energy in earth, it would eventually run down. Notice the very early idea of entropy. Spirit's emptiness, thereby mind. Otherwise, it would presumably evaporate. Notice that the mind is a kind of a form for spirit, and that without mind, spirit probably would evaporate. But mind is the kind of form exactly right for spirit, because in its infinite freedom, it allows spirit to be whatever it is. To be whatever it is. So that mind gives a form for spirit consistent with the nature of spirit and consonant with the true structure of mind. Spirit's emptiness, thereby mind, otherwise it would presumably evaporate. Valley's emptiness, thereby filled, otherwise they would presumably eventually be exhausted. The 10,000 things, emptiness, thereby having life, otherwise they would presumably be eventually extinguished. Princes and kings' emptiness, thereby is a standard, but esteeming themselves high, they would presumably fall. Therefore the noble take from the people their root. The high's foundation is upon the low. Therefore princes and kings call themselves orphans, widows, and not worthies. Thus, they take from the people their root. Eh? Not so? Huh? Lao Tzu here in the Tao Te Ching uses a kind of almost rough interrogative syllables that have no sense. They don't say anything, but they're like our interrogative syllables. A, huh? Meaning, do you get it? But without saying anything, just nudging us. Now what he has done here, he has in the 38th and 39th chapters. In the first part of the 38th, he's showing us the integration of Te. In the second part of the 38th, he's showing us the disintegration. In the 39th chapter, he's shown us the integration of Te. And in the second half of the 39th, he's shown us the way in which the differentiation is made. So there's a parallel, there's a correspondence between the 38th and the 39th chapter. In the first part of each one, he shows us the integration of Te, the ecology by which it brings itself together. But in the 38th, he's shown us how disorder happens by losing. In the 39th, he's shown us how by keeping emptiness clearly in perspective, differentiation happens rather than disorder. So that in a structural way, without saying it in so many words, but by demonstrating it in structures of presentation, Lao Tzu has brought us to where he can say, huh? Eh? Is it not so? And then he brings in just a couple of lines, just a few characters each, to make not the final crescendo of a point, but to make this all come together in its correspondence so that the next chapter can occur naturally out of these two. So that always in Taoism, creativity is a phase form yielding. This phase, when it's done what it needs to do, prepares a space for the next phase to happen. And that next phase accepts that key and develops it to what it needs to, and then it develops a transition to the next. So that there's constantly in Taoism this sense that the correspondences move by this yielding to one another. So that the harmony is not so much a harmony that all these things are struck, but that there is a movement. The key is a dynamic of yielding correspondences occurring together. And in terms of time, it happens spontaneously, almost instantly. We'll see. Because the last three lines read like this. Therefore, he's given us the integration, the disintegration. The integration, the differentiation. Okay? Not so. Therefore, letting go to pieces a carriage wheel, it is no longer a carriage wheel. Do not desire to be respected like a gem and let them down like a stone. In other words, don't carry the gestalts that are very powerful past their usefulness, past their applicability. Don't make the powerful ideas overshoot the ability of actuality to carry it. If a carriage wheel falls apart and it's just parts of wood and iron, don't say any longer it's a carriage wheel. And he says that most people who gain some power of themselves try to make out as if they are like gems. But when other people try to count on them as if they were gems, those people let those people down as if they were just stones. So what's the next chapter? Traditionally it was chapter 41, but actually in the old Ma Lang Tui, we're going to move chapter 40 out of the way and make it 41, and we're going to put chapter 41 in its place. And the third in this sequence, 38, 39, and now 41. So the sequence, notice here, is rather heavily amended by our knowledge from archaeology of the way in which the original order went. Now 41 comes out of 38 and 39 naturally. And 40 will come out of those three naturally. And when those four are put together in this sequencing, this correspondent sequencing, the first chapter we get to next week, chapter 42, one of the most significant and memorable of the Tao Te Ching, is the one in which Lao Tzu brings the five-phase energy cycle into a full exposition for the first time. In other words, the original Te Tao Ching showed the reader, showed the listener how to hear this book, how to hear this language. Because the very first thing a very wise human being wishes to say to you is not the content of what they want to say. They don't tell you right away what they want to say. They try to determine, if you have the sensitivity, if you can hear what they're about to say. They try to establish to you first, do you know how to listen? If you know how to listen to my language, I will then tell you the exact truth. So the Tao Te Ching, the Te Tao Ching, originally prepared the hearers, the readers, to hear and read it right. And so the first 5 sections of the Te Tao Ching were all about how to hear it in small and how to hear gestalts in large, and then how to carry that facility on into the rest of the book. The 41st chapter, I translated the title of it, Identity and Rightness. It's a Chinese character that's very similar to righteousness. It's also E, but it's pronounced a little bit differently. Righteousness is E, and this is E. Identity and rightness. So chapter 41, and here's the translation of there. Superior learners, hearing of Tao, are disciplined and practice itself. Average learners, hearing of Tao, sometimes keep, sometimes lose it. The ping pong game. Inferior learners, hearing of Tao, in a big way ridicule it. If not ridiculed by them, it could not thus be regarded as Tao. Why would inferior learners ridicule it? Because they are at home in being out of sync, and the Tao's smoothness seems ridiculous to them. What could be more stupid than to be so gullible to believe that you could be eternal now by your own efforts? What a laughable person you must be. It's like that, only on a very serious level. Notice now that just like in the 38th and 39th chapter, Lao Tzu now does a pivot. It's almost like a dance step. It's almost like in dance, where after a certain movement, in order to shift the emphasis of the body, one shifts the pivot from one leg to the other, or from the way in which the movement is coming up to the movement coming down on the same leg. Whatever it is, it's like a pivot. Here's the pivot for the third time. Therefore, of those who build words, one says it, bright Tao resembles the dark. Advanced in Tao resemble the retreating. Straight in Tao resembles the roundabout. Superior Te resembles the valley. The perfectly unblemished are likely to be shamed. Amplest Te resembles non-sufficiency. Established Te resembles the unfinished. Why does it resemble the unfinished? If you finish something, polish it, your confidence is that the thingness in this world is what's important to complete. Whereas established Te realizes that the next phase, releasing the next phase, keeping the key going, is what is important. So that established Te resembles the unfinished. Amplest Te resembles non-sufficiency. Relational. It all goes together. Simple substance resembles the Ching. The biggest square of all has no corner. The biggest container is not yet completed. The biggest sound is void of voice. The biggest form has no shape. Tao hidden, empty of name. However exact Tao can give and complete. Whatever the specifications for exactness, the psychology of the real, the Tao can give and complete. So after these three chapters, here comes the fourth chapter, the final one for tonight, numbered chapter 40 in most translations. It's very short. In fact, it's only a few lines. Usually it's translated as 4 lines. I've translated it as 5 lines, in keeping with the way in which the flow of the Chinese language is. Chapter 40 has a mysterious title. The title is best translated as Avoiding Function. And here's how it reads in very short translation. Returning is Tao itself's movement. Yielding is Tao itself's function. Heaven, earth, the things, are resonant by existence. existence is consonant with the empty. Returning is Tao itself's movement. Yielding is Tao itself's function. Heaven, earth, the things are resonant by existence. Existence is consonant with the empty. And so in this way, the first 4 chapters of the Tao Te Ching set up a pattern which will be characteristic all the way through. Lao Tzu will show us how integrations happen, how disorders happen, how integrations can happen in such a way that differentiations complement them, not disorder, and how there is such a way that we can learn to see gestalts forming in our language area of human-heartedness, our mind, that those gestalts can unfold just like clouds forming over a mountain and be absolutely natural. So that to a Taoist, there are some ideas that are as real as mountains and streams. Ideas are not always bogus, but one has to have a real mind in order to have real vision, real ideas. Notice that the standard of a really good idea to a Taoist is not whether it is logically sound or not. That's extraneous. It's not whether that idea is original necessarily or not. It's not even whether that idea has possibilities, potential. The beauty, the sublimity of an idea to a Taoist is that it is released by the equanimity of the full human spirit in such a way that it helps structure a world which can return back into Tao without leaving any kind of blemish or trace, so that no disorder occurs, so that no tendency to try and force something to happen occurs. Notice that the use of force to a Taoist is a sure symptom that the whole cycle is out of kilter. Where is the cycle out of kilter? It is always out of kilter in someone. It is never because Tao has screwed up. It's never because oneness, Te, has lost its efficacy. It's because someone is not balancing in equanimity their full capacity, their full existence. They're not being consonant with the Tao. If they were consonant with the Tao, then the world that they would be living in and making would be consonant with them. So that the Tao and the world would be consonant through ourselves. Man is the bridge between heaven and earth. And so, in this way, Western academics have misunderstood. They think that somehow Tao is like heaven, and then the world must be the place where Te works, and that the Tao Te Ching must be about politics in this world and a kind of hidden, undeveloped mysticism which leads to a metaphysics about heaven. And all of this is irrelevant. All of this has nothing whatsoever to do with Lao Tzu. Now, to show you how this movement completes itself, I'm going to give you the first couple of characters of chapter 42, which we will come back to next week, and you can hear it right at the beginning of chapter 42. You can hear everything that I've been talking about tonight comes together just like a bell. Here's how chapter 42, the 5th chapter of the Te Chao Ching, begins. It's titled Reason or Tao's Transformation. Tao produces unity. Unity produces duality. Duality produces trinity. Trinity produces the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things bear yin on their backs and embrace the yang. So you can see how it begins. It begins with the 5-phase energy cycle and then brings into play the way in which yin-yang participate in that. So that the 42nd chapters we see next week, we'll start with it right away, introduces the great stepping up of intelligence to realize that not only does this energy cycle occur, but it occurs with a yin-yang weave, so that each phase has a yang and has a yin phase, so that all together, though there are 5 phases, there are 10 stems, as they say, and that these 10 stems then have a very particular kind of a structure and a form. And they will be complemented later on by the development of a perception that the center quality of these 5, the center, always has a correspondence to the return, and so in order to state it accurately, in some modes you have to double it. And by doubling it, you add not just one more in the middle, but you add another pair in the middle, and what you get is 12-part movement. And so in Chinese Taoist thought, much later than Lao-Tzu, what is developed are the 10 heavenly branches, stems, and the 12 earthly branches. And this kind of movement between these two modes becomes characteristic of the way in which Taoism then characterizes the larger pattern of this world and ourselves. Next week.